So that split in your family, where where the middle class was Zionist and the working class was non-Zionist, and even your working class uncle went over to the Zionists, that's really a perfect metaphor for the conflict in the Jewish community in the early part of the 1900s, where Zionism, as you told me earlier, was a phenomenon, a middle class phenomenon, and one over a section of the working class.
Yes. Yeah. But not a large section of the working class. In the elections in 1936 in Warsaw, the Zionists got a minimal percentage of the vote. The Bund got, the plurality of votes.
So most of the Warsaw Ghetto was Bundist and Anti-Zionist.
A large part of it, there's also traditional Orthodox Jewish, segment, who voted for religious parties that were not Zionist for religious reasons. There is political anti-Zionism and there is religious anti-Zionism.
Like in the Cherry Carter.
Yes.
So did your mother tell you any stories of the Bund and Warsaw Ghetto, or actually that was mostly little?
Yeah, she told me one particular story. One time the Jewish Bund went on a strike. All the Jewish workers went on strike, usually against Jewish employers, because only Jewish employers provided work. There were the brush makers, which were very important. My mother worked as a clerk in a store. And even her boss was a Bundist. But he couldn't go on strike against himself, So my mother liked him so much that she actually came to work that day. And her boss told her to go and leave work in order to respect the strike, in support of the strike. So, the Bund was very influential, very strong. But the other interesting thing that we can consider is the nature of the political currents, in the beginning of the 60s, especially in in the international arena, which is reflected in the political movements in Toronto, where I was active until 1982. I was active in the political movements in Toronto from 1966 till 1982. On my own, I realized the importance of political work, because we had to stop fascism. And to stop fascism, you had to get rid of capitalism. It was very clear to me, obvious. So I went and joined the Social Democratic Party, which was the only progressive party that I knew of. And it was called the New Democratic Party, the NDP, which arose out of the CCF, Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which was started by Tommy Douglas, who was motivated by some sort of Christian progressive sentiment, as was the case in the English Revolution with Gerald Winstanley. If you read those original documents, you'll find a heavy Christian strain to them, defending the poor people against the evil rich and all that. So I joined the NDP, and the activists that I met in the NDP happened to be all Trotskyists of the Fourth International, the current called the United Secretariat, because the Fourth International had split previously and had recently become reunited, formed a United Secretariat between North America and Europe. The European faction, the Fourth International United Secretariat allowed for the formation of factions, so that it maintained the unity of their organization, but allowed you to have differences, that were developed in various documents at congresses, in the name of one faction or another. So the European faction was led by Ernest Mandel, the political economist, and the North American faction was led by the American SWP, Socialist Workers' Party. So the Canadian section, which is called the League for Socialist Action, aligned itself with the American SWP, with James P. Cannon, who was the founder of that movement. And the organizer of the LSA in Canada was a magnificent man who was very welcoming to me and was a Canadian, English Canadian, who was the least racist, Canadian I ever met. It was wonderful. Ross Dowson. I worked with him when I was organizer for the group that we were in. And the LSA had a youth movement associated with it called the Young Socialists. And I was an organizer of the Young Socialists. And I organized as an activist with the Young Socialists, but in the name of the NDP, as a secret Trotskyist within the NDP. I organized a club in my high school, the Harvard Collegiate Institute. This was the first high school NDP club, and it was recognized as a socialist club, even as a Trotskyist club. And we won this, even under the threat of expulsion from the school principal, because I went to the chairman of the Board of Education, who upheld our right to form a political party, because after all, we were supposed to be a democracy, and there was this whole social movement in the 60s that was propelling and pushing and imposing democracy and all sorts of institutions in civil society. So everybody had to pretend that they were Democrats. So it worked, we had a functioning NDP club, which held meetings after school, extracurricular activity and all that. And we even formed a Vietnam anti-war committee, held a teach-in in our high school. Yeah, with about 100, 200 participants. So we managed to do a few things. Yeah. And then this was duplicated in other high schools. Others, began to sort of do similar club formations. And we formed a movement, New Democratic Youth. But then there were some communists inside the NDP who got jealous of the work that I was doing and wanted me expelled. So they started to denounce me and circulated rumors. And I was accused of being a member of the LSA, which I wasn't at the time. And I was expelled by a 2/3 vote of the Provincial Council of the Ontario New Democratic Party in 1970. When I was 19 years old, I was considered to be such a threat.
Is it because of an opposition between communism and Trotskyism?
Yes, the communists and Trotskyists were very much opposed. The Trotskyists organized an anti-war movement around Vietnam that was called anti-war rather than peace movement. The communists organized with the liberals called the peace movement. And we held separate demonstrations on each day of international action, to end the war in Vietnam.
What was the difference between anti-war and peace?
Peace had a different program than the anti-war movement. The peace movement called for stopping the bombing of North Vietnam, because North Vietnam was a communist regime, so the communists wanted to protect the communist regime. Okay. Whereas the anti-war movement called for the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam as a whole. You see, because there was a difference between North Vietnam and South Vietnam.
South Vietnam was a democracy.
Was a democracy like Iraq is a democracy. Yeah.
So, on a more ideological level, what was the difference between the Trotskyists and the communists towed the party line and the communist countries? Yeah, the Canadian Communist Party was very much subordinate, to the Russian Communist Party. Whereas the Trotskyists were against imperialism in all its forms, be it communist, Soviet imperialism, or... Well, the Trotskyists didn't call Soviet expansionism, Communist Party centralized control, didn't call that imperialism. It was not considered imperialism. Imperialism is a term reserved for capitalist aggrandizement. And the Trotskyists also did not consider the Soviet Union to be state capitalist, as some of the political currents, developed a theory of later on. It considered it to be a degenerated worker state. Okay, that was the official term. So the Trotskyists and the communists did not get along, even though the youth headquarters for the Trotskyist movement was on the same street, a few houses away from the Communist Party headquarters on Cecil Street in Toronto, across the street from the Steelworkers Hall. So did both parties try to win over the workers? Yeah. So of course the communists had more of an influence, on the working class. They formed the leadership of some of the unions, like the electrical workers union, the electricians union, was led by the Communist Party. The Trotskyists didn't have any unions under their leadership, but they had much more of an influence in the student movement. So the Trotskyists recognized that the student movement could become a progressive revolutionary force, whereas the official, communist line was that the students were petty bourgeois, because they were going to become part of the working class, part of the middle class. They were destined to be middle class. And also previously,
working class kids didn't get to go to university. It was all the middle class, families that sent their kids to university. However, in the 60s, there were student loans and grants. And the poorest kids, like me, got 100% grant. I got free education, free tuition, plus a stipend. So all of a sudden, me, working class kid, gets to go to university and study physics. So I did. And I realized, students are not necessarily, middle class people. And while there are students, they're not middle class. They're just students. And they're, working, intellectual workers, who are unpaid to boot. So you have to develop a totally different approach, to the student movement. And there was a document written in the Fourth International along these lines called the Red University Strategy. But the document was never adopted by the Fourth International because of those sectarian actions that considered that the students were nonetheless a middle-class phenomenon and rhetorically so, etc., etc.
So they didn't recognize those factions as well as the Communist Party didn't recognize that the intelligentsia could serve a role to make a revolution.
Yeah, and this followed the conception of the Jewish people as middle class or bourgeois phenomena, because a lot of Jewish people, when they became educated, went into intellectual worker occupations, accountants. They even have set up their own offices. And this was considered to be, a capitalist enterprise. At the same scale as a bourgeois corporation. There was no differentiation made. And intellectual workers were not really considered to be workers. It was only the industrial working class that was considered to be the working class, so-called, according to Marxist theory. So the Trotskyists hesitated and then fell, when it came to actually developing new political economic analysis, because they weren't able to follow through with the analysis because they realized it was going beyond, what Marxists had conditioned people to think in terms of. Yeah. So, and then the Trotskyist movement itself developed certain sectarian tendencies, and factions were regarded as disloyal, even though they were legal, and strategies then became matters of principle. All of a sudden, whether or not to work with the NDP, the Social Democratic Party, to develop an enlarged working class party became a matter of heresy. Talking about Canadian economic dependency on the United States, being economically occupied by the United States, suddenly became, bourgeois nationalist, ideology. All these sort of sectarian things, began to be put into place, mainly because of the influence of the faction from Europe under Mandel. Even though Mandel, wrote some brilliant stuff, and, was capable of analysis, nonetheless he sort of imposed this on others, because it served the interests of the dominance of this particular political faction over the Fourth International. So there was a split between the factions within the LSA in Canada, and eventually our faction left the LSA because it couldn't stand, to be insulted anymore. And we knew that there was not going to be any progress in discussion. So we formed our own political movement, which began to grow because it was called the Forward Group, after the, much like the Forward Jewish newspaper in New York, which was initially an anarchist socialist publication. Yeah, they just had an article about the history of the Forward, in which they were initially called by the Wall Street Journal some anarchist, band. And then Forward Group, or this Socialist League, was the political name. But then we dropped the political name and we just called it by the name of the newspaper that we put out, called the Forward. And that lasted a couple of years, and I was full-time organizer for that group, actually. As I was for the League for the Young Socialists, I was a summer youth organizer for that full-time as well at the time. I took a year off graduate school to be an organizer for the Forward Group. And it grew, and we had a circulation of our paper. We developed the idea that you could distribute the paper for free. then ask for donations to finance it. To sort of try to impose, like 50 cents or $1 on a working class person, just to do us the favor of reading our paper, seemed ridiculous. So we abandoned this bourgeois concept of selling our paper, and we gave it away for free. So I organized distributions, like every month, for our paper. We arrived at a total of circulation of 5,000 per month, mainly in Toronto area. So it became, quite widespread, and the articles were well written, in a non-dogmatic way, and we had some new people who were educated, well educated, so it became quite a good paper. I wasn't allowed to write for it because I didn't follow the party line as much as, even though I was the organizer, But then eventually our differences began to develop, and I quit. I couldn't take, being in that party convention anymore because of this mentality of the party line. So then I became an independent activist. I sort of, gravitated towards the anarchists. We formed an anarchist bookstore in Toronto. I formed an anarchist bookstore in Toronto called, it was called Focus Books and Art. And then we lived upstairs, and we had about 20 people in it. And then we had a split, at that time, the war in Lebanon broke out. The first Israeli invasion of Lebanon broke out, and the Palestinian ambassador in Ottawa, Abdullah, he called me and asked me to come to work with him as an assistant. So I left the bookstore. It was maintained by a Palestinian colleague for a while. The anarchists left the bookstore, and then when my Palestinian brother came to live in Ottawa himself, left the bookstore, and the anarchists did not continue the bookstore, and no other bookstore since 1980 has been formed in Toronto. So the whole existence of the anarchist bookstore in Toronto has failed because of that split in the 80s.
What was why did the Communist Party support Zionism?
Communist Party helped to support the establishment of the Zionist State of Israel in 1948 because Russia considered that the Jewish Communist Party in Palestine was gaining in strength and could become the government of Israel one day. And they also wanted to relegate the Jewish national identity to a nation state outside of Russia, because they wanted any Jewish nationalists to leave Russia, because they didn't want them to be organizing within Russia because of anti-Semitism. So because of anti-Semitism, they supported Israel. And the Russian Communist Party directed the Czechoslovakian Communist Party to provide the Zionist militias with the arms necessary that they found necessary to expel the Palestinian population.
So they weren't even the Communist Party was even conscious of the oppression of Palestinians.
No, Palestinians were, they weren't working class, therefore they didn't merit any consideration. They were peasants. Yes. So the peasants don't count.
Which was in line with their linear periodization.
Yes. Yeah. In spite of Lenin's formulation, the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry.
But in the Israeli Communist Party, they were at first some Palestinian Arabs in the early days, right? They were split.
Yes.
Because the Jewish Zionist communists couldn't really, get over the Jews' domination of the Palestinians. But the Trotskyists reject Zionism. What was Trotsky's thing on Zionism?
Trotskyism rejected Zionism all along the way. Yeah, Trotskyism was principled in that respect. Not always for the best reasons, because at first Trotskyism rejected the Jewish national identity. Considered that the Jewish workers would assimilate to become just, Russian workers. However, with the onset of Nazism and the Holocaust, Trotsky, in an interview in 1939, reversed his position. And Bronstein decided that Jewish national identity existed, that it had legitimacy for the foreseeable future, would continue to exist, and that there had to be a program which addressed the existence of the Jewish people, even if it included a territorial solution, even while excluding the Zionist option.
So he also excluded the Zionist option?
Yes, at the same time.
Because of the colonization of Palestine?
Yes. Zionism was an imperialist phenomenon, that's quite possible. But, the Zionists tried to claim that he had gone over to Zionism. But he had not. He had adopted a certain respect for territorialism, which the slogan of which is, land without a people for a people without a land.
Which is an ideal in a sense, because by the 20th century, there really was no land without people in the world.
Oh no, there's lots of land in Siberia, northern Canada. Still, there's lots. There's lots of empty spaces, inhospitable spaces. But still, there's land available. If one really seriously wants to provide for Jewish territory, it can be done without, dispossessing other people.
That was what Trotsky didn't in the Zionists, because the Zionists dispossessed the Palestinians.
He didn't mention that, but he recognized Zionism as a bourgeois phenomenon, in alliance with the bourgeois. So for that reason, for political reasons, he rejected Zionism.
But did he change his position to recognize Jewish national identity and other things because of the dangers of the Holocaust? So that kind of welcoming of the realizing that people need to like history itself.
Yeah, because even the German working class was going anti-Semitic. So you can't tell Jewish Germans, they have to become part of the German working class when the German working class didn't want any Jewish people. It's just an impossible proposition.
Trotsky never really identified himself as a Jew. I mean, he did. He didn't, like Marx, to obliterate.
Yes, he had always rejected Jewish identity. However, at certain times, he sort of stepped into Jewish politics, nonetheless. For instance, in the certain congresses of the International, when Trotsky didn't have a political organization that he could represent to be delegated in the international congresses of the Communist International, the Third International, or even the Second International, sometimes he went as a Bundist delegate.
Oh, really?
Yes. Then he formed an international of his own, called the Second and a Half International, if you've heard of this. It was an anti-war international, and it put out a manifesto in Zimmerwald. So it was called the Zimmerwald Manifesto, or the Zimmerwald International, or the Second and a Half International. And between the Second International, which went to support the various national bourgeoisies in their war, of the First World War, and before the Communist International was founded, with the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. So in between those two, there was a need for international work, and Trotsky had to form the Second and a Half International. And then he became a disciplined member of the Communist Party and gave his loyalty to Lenin, and abandoned, his independent politics, which was a mistake. But he seemed to consider that it was necessary in order to form unified leadership to ensure the success of the Russian Revolution. And then he became, the leader of the Red Army, which saved the Soviet Union, basically. Trotsky saved the Bolshevik Revolution on behalf of the Leninist leadership, and even imposed the Russian dominance over the Ukraine, because Ukraine was having its own revolution against the Tsarist rule by a leadership which was not Bolshevik, which was not Trotskyist, but was anarchist, under the leadership of Makhno, who was the organizer of the Black Army. The Black Army was fighting the White Army in the Ukraine. The Red Army came into the Ukraine and was fighting against the White Army as well. Trotsky offered an alliance to the Black Army and offered to make Makhno a general in the Red Army. But they had to dissolve the Black Army into the Red Army. Makhno refused. So they would fight against the White Army, each in their own way. And sometimes the Red Army and the Black Army would fight each other in civil war. So, and in the territory that was liberated by the Black Army, there was Jewish national cultural autonomy that was implemented.
No, really?
Yes.
Because they knew what it was like to be persecuted.
Yes, and they were internationalists, and they were not centralists, so they respected Jewish formations.
But then after the 60s, didn't the Communist Party change position after the 6-Day War and reject Zionism in Israel, or did they ever?
Yes, because even it was it started to change after '56, because when Israel aligned with Britain and France to occupy the Suez Canal, when the Suez Canal was nationalized by Nasser, and the imperialists counterattacked, with Israel. Even the United States of America opposed Israel at that point. So Russia certainly had to.
Yeah. What did the U.S. against Israel?
They forced Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw from the Suez Canal. Then they made an agreement with Nasser to allow for the passage, of American military boats, through the Suez Canal in return for support of the United States against imperialist occupation of the Suez Canal. Yeah. So good. I'm glad we got to talk about all of these issues. Very important. Not very well known, not written about.
Yeah.
So here we are. Thank you. Great.